Thank you, Ben. I am very grateful for this opportunity to speak on this interesting subject that I know is of interest to many of us. I only wish that it was possible for us to be together in person, as that exchange is so important. And I regret not being able to see you all, though I guess I know you're there. I'm going to give the talk from really two different perspectives today. The first is an academic Harvard perspective. What's the situation with climate change? What might we be able to do about it? And what are the engineering and practical consequences? What might be the role of the individual and so on? At the end of that, I think you will feel, as I do, somewhat dissatisfied. And with this audience, I think we have the possibility of exploring other aspects of that problem that may put the place of the individual in a very different light. And I'll be very interested to exchange with you after the talk and hear your points of view. To begin, I'd like to share something with you that we would look at for a few minutes together, and that is the status of world population. So this is a site on the web where you can access the population of the world, and the big numbers in bold at the top are showing you the increase in world population as it's happening in real time. So take a look. You can imagine that number of people appearing in whatever room you are next to you as time goes by, and how many new people there would be around you at the end of an hour. Okay, well, further down on the screen on the lower left is the population growth today, and that's 155,000 thus far. We're a little more than halfway through the day. 155,000 new people today. And just next to that over on the right is the population growth this year, close to 26 million people. We're 1/3 of the way through the year. So this year, Earth will add about 75 million new people. That's more than the population of England. It's 7 Londons. So imagine if in the UK this year you had to accommodate, build the infrastructure, support 7 new Londons. That's happening every year on Earth. So we really can't ignore the population factor in terms of the burden that the Earth needs to bear in being able to support the human beings who live on it. Okay, so we're going to be bearing that in mind as we go through the talk. And when I look at this title, there's 2 critical aspects: the planetary crisis, the role of the individual. Particle of a particle is just a reference to the fact of how small each one of us is. Here I am, one person out of 7.6 billion. How could what I do make any difference? I'm so small relative to my city, my country, relative to the world. So, and yet all around me, we see planetary crisis of various kinds. What then is the role of a person? Well, in the last couple of weeks, I've asked this question to various people. What planetary crisis? And about half of them say that it's global warming and climate change. To my initial surprise, a number of them said the central issue is the problem of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, racial inequities, the way women are treated around the world, and so on. Without solving that, how can we solve anything else? One person mentioned the liberal assault on personal liberty. But mostly people, if you think about it, would say, okay, it's global warming. No one mentioned population. To my surprise, no one mentioned extinction. The impact we're having on soils and groundwater is mostly invisible to us. It's not surprising that people didn't mention that. And the most important thing is that no one mentioned the broken relationship between human beings and the planet. We come from the planet over 4.5 billion years of evolution. We depend on it entirely for our well-being. And the future of the planet is clearly dependent on us because of our global impacts. So this relationship between human beings and the planet is the central question of our time, the central crisis of our time. That's not the viewpoint at Harvard. The viewpoint there is instead that it's climate, it's global warming, and we have the mental horsepower and the engineering creativity to be able to address this problem. Bill Gates, who has consulted with a lot of people of Harvard, has recently come out with a new book. The cover is shown to you in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And the first sentence of that book is that there are two numbers you need to know about climate change, 51 billion and 0. 51 billion is the 51 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Think about it, 51 billion tons. And the other is the 0. That's the number of tons we need to get to if we're going to do something about climate change. Because even if we cut that 51 billion in half, we're still adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Things keep getting worse and worse. There's nothing we can do. So it has to go to 0. That's the big challenge. How can we get there? I thought it might be interesting to start instead with the question of how did we get here? How did we get where we are today? Why is it that we have this problem? And the problem we have is population growth. If we only had 1% as many people on the earth, there'd be no problem at all. So what has allowed our population to grow so rapidly? It's been principally the access to energy. Energy gives us access to food, to metal, technology, transportation of our food, fertilizer. It's what allows more and more of us to exist and survive. The discovery of the Americas was also not insequential. It opened vast new land area. And medical advances have greatly decreased child mortality, which used to be greater than 50% and is now very low, and extended our lifetimes from 40-some years on average to 70-some years for most of us. So this, of course, leads to large changes in the population. Now, this energy growth, energy access is truly extraordinary. And I show it to you in a graph, and I apologize for the number of graphs I'm going to show you in the next few minutes. But a lot of this is about numbers. On this graph, the vertical axis is the number of watts per person that each one of us makes use of. Watts per person. Watts is how much power is generated. A 100-watt light bulb uses 100 watts continually when it's on. It turns out that our bodies, through food and through air, make use of 100 watts of energy. It's amazing. Everything we do, running, thinking, talking, all of that runs on just 100 watts. But that 100 watts is similar for us as for other animals. What changes the situation is the extra energy we're able to access through fossil fuels. So in America, we access 10,000 watts per person. That's 100 times our background energy use. Globally, it's 2,300 watts per person. That's 23 times the energy use. And that's on average. In a given moment, the amount of energy we can access is absolutely huge. If we turn on an oven, or if we run a tractor or fly an airplane, we have access to huge amounts of energy. And this makes us into supermen. We can fly through the air, go faster than a speeding bullet, leap tall mountains with a single bound, see through walls, send messages over thousands of miles instantaneously, like is happening right now. So this, what I call the human energy revolution, is what has made population growth possible, and what makes our life as we know it possible. Now, the population growth is also extraordinary. On this graph on the top, we show you the total population versus time, and it's a logarithmic scale. So exponential growth is linear on a logarithmic scale. And you can see on that diagram that recently, suddenly the slope became very, very steep, climbing up towards the top of the screen. So the growth rate has increased. And in the lower graph, I show you the growth rate through time. For thousands of years, the growth rate of human population was about 0.1% per year. That's doubling every 500 or 1,000 years. And then after the Industrial Revolution and the discovery of fossil fuels, that growth rate increased to 2% per year. That's doubling every 36 years. It's completely different. If we had 100 million people, 200 million people on Earth at the time of the Roman era, and we were growing at 0.1% per year, we've gone 2,000 years, we would have doubled twice, we'd have less than 1 billion people on Earth. And yet we had 1 billion people on Earth in 1900, and we've got 7.6 billion people on Earth today. We've been doubling every 35 years or so, and it has a huge impact. So if there were a disaster of unimaginable proportions, such that 97% of human beings alive today died suddenly, 29 out of 30 people that you know would be dead a year from now. Well, there would be the same number of people as there were in 1600. The time of Newton, Leonardo da Vinci, Bach. Wonderful things happening on Earth with 30 times fewer people. And in 1600, after the Black Death, there were about the same number of people on Earth as there were at the height of the Roman Empire. So there'd been 1,600 years of almost zero population growth. And then suddenly, with the discovery of energy, population took off. So the other thing that's happened, surprisingly, is that we've become used to continuous economic growth. So you can do a simple, funny thought experiment of saying you give somebody a penny at the time of the birth of Christ, and you have that penny grow at 2% per year, real time. How rich is that person today? And that person owns more than the total global economy many times over today. So economic growth, even at what we would call an unacceptable rate of 2% per year, is completely unrealistic when you're looking at timeframes of 2,000 years. But we're used to it. And with that growth comes increased use of energy. So here we show the plot of GDP per capita versus the energy that is used per person. And you can see that energy use and economic growth go hand in hand. So you have North America out here, and you have the poor countries of Africa down here. And everyone wants economic growth. And if you have economic growth, you're going to be using more energy. And if you use more energy, then you're going to be emitting more CO2. Here we have CO2 on the vertical axis versus the GDP. The higher the GDP, the better off you are, the more CO2 you emit. So that means that the CO2 emissions are a product of the population times the GDP times how much energy it takes to make $1 of GDP times the amount of CO2 you emit to produce that amount of energy. And so we can look at all these individual terms and see what's important. And when we do that, we have the population, which is increasing substantially. You can see that goes from 0 to almost 150%. That's the population contribution to CO2 emissions. We're doing better with energy intensity. We get more GDP growth per amount of CO2 emitted. That's partly due to all the economic growth coming from computers, which doesn't use as much CO2 per economic growth as if you're doing something like making steel or automobiles. And so the GDP per capita is going up. And the product of those things, the population, the GDP per capita, and the energy intensity leads to your total CO2 emissions. And they go up a bit more than population growth because GDP per capita is growing faster than the efficiency of the GDP. That's a bit technical, but if you look at the bottom line, it means that CO2 in the atmosphere is growing. And these are the measurements of CO2, the little squiggles on here because of seasonal variations. And you can see this is concave upwards. That means CO2 in the atmosphere is growing exponentially. It's growing more and more, faster and faster every year. And what that's done is it's taken us from, now we're looking at 600,000 years, and the natural fluctuations of CO2 as we go in and out of ice age cycles. And in previous warm periods in between ice age cycles, like we are now, we were at around 250 parts per million CO2. And this slide is a bit old. It shows us at 300. Actually, we're up at 400 now, way up here on this next diagram. And the other greenhouse gases, like methane, are also much higher than they've ever been in past times. So we're really doing an unprecedented experiment, unprecedented over the last tens of millions of years on the Earth. When CO2 was last this high, the sea level was many tens of meters higher than it is today. And if Greenland and Antarctica were to melt, sea level would be 200 meters, 600 feet higher than it is today. So what can be done about it? We need to look at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And it turns out that cement, steel, and plastics are a big chunk of it, about a third. And cutting CO2 emissions from that aspect of them is very difficult. It requires new technologies. For example, the calcium in cement comes from limestone, and limestone is half calcium and half CO2. So for every atom of calcium you get to make cement, you emit a molecule of CO2. So China, for example, is using more cement in the last decade than the rest of the world has used this century. So the amount of cement being used is huge. We need cement, we need steel, we use plastics for everything. So that's a difficult one to solve. Of course, it's not personal. The electricity, that's manageable to change it by using renewables, but it's likely a 40-year process. Renewables are currently making about 10% of global energy. To increase that is a many-decade problem, and I'll be talking a little bit more about the problems of transitioning to renewable energy in a moment. The problem is that the power density for fossil fuels, if you take how much fossil fuel you can put into a square foot of land, you have this huge amount of power you can get out of it. The same thing is true from nuclear energy. And solar energy is about a factor of 100 less. and wind is about a factor of 1,000 less. So you can imagine if you have how much space a regular utility plant takes up versus how much space a solar farm takes up that could produce the same amount of energy. It uses vastly more land. Sun and wind are also variable. You have no sun at night. You have times when you have less wind. And so at scale, you have difficult storage problems. What do you do about energy at night? What do you do about energy in the winter when the days are much shorter? That creates very difficult storage problems that are not yet solved and require major technological advances. Transportation, air travel, we don't see how it's going to be possible to get that out of liquid fuels. So you need to be able to make liquid fuels off the electrical grid when that's changed. Electric cars, we say, oh, that's going to be great. But if you have an electric car running off a coal plant, you're still emitting huge amounts of CO2 even with the electric car. Heating and cooling, we can solve with heat pumps, which I won't go into. And it's also solvable if we get all the energy to be green. And in agriculture, vegan diets would reduce emissions by half, but that still leaves us up at around 10% of emissions. It's hard to get rid of the other 10%. So we can do all these things, and that could be making a big difference. It could maybe cut us down by 50% or 70%. But the problem is that every atom of CO2 added to the atmosphere increases global warming. Even if you cut CO2 emissions by 2/3, you're still raising CO2 in the atmosphere and you're making the problem worse. And even cutting emissions by that much is difficult because coal plants in the developing world have a 30-year lifetime. These are CO2 emissions by China. China was building a coal plant a week up to a year or two ago, and now they're trying to export their coal technology to the rest of the developing world. India, you can also see, is growing in its CO2 emissions. So if the USA and the EU, shown here in green and blue, cut their emissions by a lot, and you still have this CO2 growth in the developing world, no hope. The other thing is that we've been talking about doing something about it for a long time, and essentially nothing has happened. This is demand for crude oil worldwide since 2005. You see it just keeps going up. This is the dip for COVID-19. This is projections out to the year 2026. If we wanted to do something about it, it would require the political will roughly equivalent to that of World War II. And of course, in World War II, there were not the opposing forces that we're facing today. So President Biden this week suggested the US might be able to cut its emissions in half by 2030, but the Harvard experts think that's impossible. And the aim of zero by 2050 is even more difficult. And they may get lost because certain things you can do to cut your emissions in half make it more difficult to get to zero. For example, replacing coal with natural gas cuts your emissions a lot, but then you're locked into natural gas, which leads to great long-term emissions. The third thing is that oil is just incredibly cheap. So here's the oil price since 1950. It's been very variable recently, but is hovering around $40 per barrel. That's about $1 per gallon. Gasoline in the United States is about $3 per gallon now, and that's far cheaper than bottled water. So I went on the web today and found how much it would cost to buy about a gallon of Fiji water, and it's about $10 per gallon. So as long as oil is cheaper than water, it makes it very difficult not to use it. And atmospheric CO2 continues to grow exponentially. We need to get to zero emissions, but even the growth in renewable energy, which is truly remarkable, is really just taking care of the incremental growth in energy usage. It's not cutting down our CO2 emissions. It's simply taking care of the growth so that the CO2 emissions are not growing quite as fast. So the long-term solution to much of this is direct capture of CO2 out of the atmosphere. That might be possible eventually at $100 a ton. That would be $5.1 trillion per year every year. That's 6% of the global economy. That would be roughly the equivalent of a COVID-19 crisis every year in terms of expense. And this would be a new industry as large as today's oil industry. And the technology is not there yet. It's potentially hopeful on many, many decades or perhaps century timescale. But despite these difficulties, let's stay optimistic. And we can ask then, what is the role of the individual in all this? And I asked my Harvard colleagues about that this week. And the consensus is there's really no place for the individual. It all depends on technology, government regulation, industry. Talking to some family members, they said that anything they could do as an individual is trivial. And what's important, the only thing that's important is to get corporations to change. And Bill Gates, at the end of his book, suggests the main thing we can do is engage in the political process at local, in the US, states, national, international levels. We can vote with our paycheck by paying more for green products, reduce our home emissions, and every once in a while, try a plant-based burger. So if you go on the web, you can find a carbon footprint calculator and see what we really might do as individuals. Americans were profligate with our use of energy. So for me, for example, in looking at this, I found it might be possible to reduce my CO2 by 4 tons per year for a household. Becoming vegan adds another 2 tons. It's a significant contribution. So if everyone did this, if we all became vegan and all households participated, that would be about a 15 to 20% reduction. That's not nothing. That's a lot. And so there is a role for the individual. There we go. Is there a role for the individual in the planetary crisis? Yes. 20% with significant changes in behavior and diet. It's not very satisfying. And it also ignores things that are being really ignored at Harvard and elsewhere. And that is, it's not just climate. So it's curious to me that there is this almost exclusive emphasis on climate change. We have other problems, less visible, still very significant, such as what's happening to groundwater, what's happening to soils, what's happening to biodiversity. And the biggest factor is population. So it's the primary driver for all our environmental impacts, coupled with economic growth. And the combination of those two leads to increased meat consumption. And increased meat consumption is a fundamental driver of planetary deterioration. So here's how meat consumption goes with GDP. And we have GDP on the horizontal axis and meat supply per person on the vertical axis. In the United States, we're way up here. The UK is down here somewhere. There it is. So 80 or 100 kilograms per person. If you go to Central Africa, you're looking at far less, 5 times less. But as countries become more prosperous, then those countries that are more prosperous end up eating more meat. So here's meat consumption by selected country for the last 50 years. And the US has grown slowly and is going down a little bit as people eat more vegetarian diets. But you can see China, it's increasing dramatically, as it is in Brazil. And so total meat consumption in the world is going up like this over the same time frame. And this is the change from 1961 to 2018, going up from 70 million to almost 350 million, a factor of 5 in 50 years. All right, so why does this matter? If you want to create a pound of beef, it takes about 20 pounds, 25 pounds of, or want to make a kilo of beef, it takes 25 kilos of feed. For lamb and pork, it's a little bit less, but you can imagine if instead of eating a kilo of grain yourself, instead you want to eat a kilo of meat, then that's like you eating 25 kilos of grain. And that takes a lot of land and a lot of energy. So the share of cereals, the share of our agricultural output that is devoted to feeding animals is huge. All these red and orange colors are more than 50%. So it's true in Central Africa, it's down around 10 or 20%. But if you go to Brazil, if you go to the United States, Australia, you're talking about 50 to 80% of the food that's grown goes to feeding animals. In the UK, only 15% of agricultural land is used to grow crops for humans. 22% is used to grow crops for livestock, and grassland for livestock accounts for the remaining 63%. Almost all of the land is being used for animals. All right, so if we increase GDP for everyone, which is good, and along with GDP went the increase in meat consumption, how much land would we need to be committed to agriculture in order to supply the meat appetites? So this is the amount of land that would be needed compared to the total amount of land available. And this is the amount per person that needs to be eaten. So if we want it to be like Canada, the US, Brazil, you need 130% of all the land on Earth in order to be able to feed the animals. If you want to be up to the amount of meat eaten by the standard person in the United Kingdom, it's 100% of all the available land on Earth. So to have this land, we need to cut down rainforests and we need to convert more and more land to agriculture. So here is the rate of rainforest deforestation in the Amazon in the top. And here's the amount of rainforest cut down in the Amazon every year on a map of the United States. So I live in Massachusetts, far more than the size of Massachusetts being cut down every year, primarily for grazing cattle and feeding them. Here's the changes in the Borneo rainforest starting in 1950. And you can see it being cut down up to 2020. A lot of this is for palm oil, but some of it is also for livestock. Okay, so let's eat fish instead. So here is the amount of fish change since 1960. It's gone up from 40 to about 160, so by a factor of 4. That's the fish catch over time. That's also related to increased prosperity and increasing population. And here's the state of the world fisheries. That this dark blue line is the fish stocks that are not fully exploited. That's down to 10%. And these are fish stocks that are fully exploited, going from 10% or overexploited, sorry, going up to more than 30% in 2009. Here's a plot showing marine protected areas in the Mediterranean and the amount of fish that are in those areas. It averages around 0.5. And this is the same inventory for areas that are fished and not protected. It's around 0.1 on average. So it's about an 80% decline of life in the ocean as a consequence of fishing and eating fish. And if you take inventories of things like sharks, you see that they're down about 80% in these inventories of shark populations. I know this personally because as part of my career, I've gone to sea. And when I first started going to sea in the 1980s, whenever we stopped the ship, we'd be surrounded by sharks. We could fish for sharks with pork chops. Now, when we go out to sea, you don't see any fish, you don't see any sharks anywhere. You just look out and the sea is like a desert. That, of course, has consequences for other life. So here's the change in seabird population, which relies on fish. And you can see the size of that population declining by about a factor of 4 over the last 50 years. How about groundwater? It's essential for global agriculture. 40% of global crop production depends on it. And 70% of world water usage is used for agriculture. As we increase population, possibly by another factor of 2, that demand will get even greater. We can evaluate groundwater resources by satellite now, which is amazing. And all of these orange and red colors are where groundwater depletion is going on, depleting a resource that is simply not replenished on human timescales. Here's the degradation of soils. This dark line up here is the erosion rate for soils that are used for agriculture. And down here is the erosion rate for natural soils. This is a log scale. So you can see you go up by about 2 orders of magnitude. Conventional agriculture causes erosion at 10 to 100 times the geological soil production rate. The clock is ticking, okay? So we're fishing out the oceans, we're degrading the soils, we're depleting groundwater, we're destroying the diversity of life on Earth, on which all ecosystems depend. Many of those things have nothing to do with climate change. And climate change is simply an expansionary factor in dealing with all of those. So one solution is to try to do something about population. So not everybody agrees population is a problem. So let's take 2 groups of 1,000 people, that's 500 couples. And one group cares, so they have 1 child per family. The other says, be fruitful and multiply, and has 4 kids per family. So 1 generation later, those 500 couples have had 1 kid each, so they're 500 descendants. And the 500 couples that have had 4 kids each have 2,000 descendants. After 2 generations, it's 250 and 4,000. After 5 generations, 150 years, there's 31 of these people left, and there's 32,000 of those people, 1,000 times more. They vote. So when you look at it that way, it can be quite discouraging. What should you do? Should you have more kids? What is possible? So what is the root problem? What is the root problem? It's not climate change. It's not GDP growth. Energy is good. There's so many wonderful things that have happened with more energy use, increasing life expectancy, decreasing poverty, increasing education for people, increasing global connectivity. We don't realize that we are planetary beings. We are a part of the planet, not a user of it. Every breath we take, every drop of food we eat is an exchange between us and the planet. And we are exquisitely attuned to this particular moment in planetary history. We're part of a process operating over billions of years of planetary evolution. And we have the unique capability and possibility of bringing awareness and consciousness to the earth. So if the galactic maintainers go around looking at the earth and they drop by every million years, so they've come 4,500 times over Earth's history. They come a million years ago and they see systems operating fine, lots of life, healthy planets. Nobody they can talk to, nobody they can communicate with. And they come today and they look and they would say, oh my God, that planet just woke up. It now has the possibility of awareness of itself, of communication with other planets in the universe, of being a part of a developing and evolutionary planetary process. And then they look more closely and they see our destructive behavior and that we kill each other and that we kill all the other animals on the planet. And they see us as being completely clueless. So the earth needs us. And it's not only that the earth needs us, but we are an integral part of the planet, completely dependent on it, dependent on planetary systems. We don't understand these systems very well, and our lives conspire to keep us unaware. How many of us are aware of soil erosion, of groundwater? We don't really know what to do about climate change. It's very difficult for me not to see anyone. So this returns to this question of the role of the individual. These problems, the root problem, that we do not recognize we are part of the planetary system, is not a societal problem. It's not something that is solved by governments or corporations or somebody else's problem. It's me. It's my problem. Nobody can solve this except me. And so it's really up to each one of us individually. So I'll ask you to do two experiments. One is to just wherever you are right now, look around. And if I look around, do I see the impact of humans on the earth? It's everywhere, right? Everything we look at, everything we see reflects this impact. Do I see my own impact on the earth? Everything in this room, I put it down. I put it there. Every way everything is organized, I did that. Every food choice that I make, every action that I take impacts the world. It's not theoretical. It's not something to argue about. It's, if we look around, it's obvious. It's evident. So the second thing I'd ask you to do is to close your eyes for a minute and just listen. Just listen to the world. Where I am, it's quite quiet. But there's traffic noises. There's an expressway not too far away. I hear it. I hear the cars go by. There's a buzzing of the refrigerator. So what I mostly hear are human sounds. So in our diminishment of the earth, we've diminished not only the life of the earth, but we've completely changed the sound of the earth and replaced those sounds with human noise. So I'm going to play something for you, which had a big impact on me when I went to the rainforest a few years ago. And I'm going to play for you rainforest sounds, which we could just listen to for a moment. That's what it's like in the rainforest. There's just no question that the earth is alive. And so if we cut down the rainforest and put a shopping mall, what are we doing? So to me, I want to raise the question of whether if we could live with this awareness of our own impact, if we could see the obvious impact that we have every moment as we live, might both our lives and the earth be transformed by this process? And of course, that's impossible. But as I've been thinking about this talk for the last 2 weeks, it's been present with me often. And I've come to realize what I think is the most dangerous pollution. The most dangerous pollution is human egotism. Through my egotism, through my desire for comfort, selfishness, ambition, I'm continually polluting the world. So if I were to diminish that pollution, what might happen? If I stop that pollution moment by moment in attitude and action, if I were to have an attitude, even occasionally, that changed from what's in it for me, or how can my life be more comfortable and require less effort, to the question of what impact I'm having and the natural inclination, which we see when we are aware of the life around us and the impact we have on it, of what can I do to help? So, what is the planetary crisis? Is it climate change? If we fix climate change tomorrow, the Earth still has a problem. And the problem is the human being. The problem is human egotism. The planetary crisis is how we interact with the Earth and how we feel in our relationship to it, or a lack of relationship to it. And so only the individual can work on that. So if that's the planetary crisis, the work of the individual is absolutely inherent to it. So this is a kind of a silly numerical exercise, but I wanted to, I pointed out this problem that we had with population growth and how people who want to have lots of kids take over the world in a century. But the power of ideas and behavior is even more powerful. So If one person influences 5 people in 1 year, and those 5 influence another 5, obviously not by lecturing them, but by example. So that's a high bar. But after 3 years, that would be 125 people. After 5 years, 3,000. After 8 years, almost 400,000. And after 10 years, 10 million. From one person. So if there were 1,000 such people, and each's influence extended to 10 million, that's 10 billion people. That's the whole world. So 1,000 such people could change the whole world in a decade. So I know many of you are interested in Gurdjieff, who was really one of the first environmentalists in a way. And he described the possibility of planetary beings where all the beings of the planet would begin to work on themselves in order to have in their consciousness the divine function of genuine conscience, by which, of course, he did not mean the normal morality that we're taught, but something residing inherently submerged but deep within us. And he suggested that people work with these 5 strivings, and the strivings are for the individual, but we might also take the risk of wiseacring, but also considering these in a planetary context. So the first striving is to have in one's ordinary being existence everything satisfying and truly necessary for the planetary body. Satisfying and truly necessary. So what if it's not just for our own body? Because if we are to address what is happening in the world, we need, through perhaps a bit of less attention to our own excess needs, to help those who are less fortunate, particularly, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. Without their needs being fulfilled, they, and we would be the same if we were in that situation, must inevitably destroy the world around them. They need it. They cut down trees for charcoal because they need it for cooking and heat. They use 50 times less energy than the average American, but they need to exploit their environment for food, warmth, and shelter. So for the world, we need to support through consideration of what we really need, also what the rest of the world needs in order to be able to satisfy their basic needs. The second was to have a constant and unflagging need for self-perfection in the sense of being. Being is a mysterious word. So, not possessions, power, conquest. The antithesis of egotism. It would be combating the primary pollutant. A third is the conscious striving to know ever more and more concerning the laws of world creation and world maintenance. As humans, we have to understand the world that we're a part of, its history, its evolution, our place in it, our relationship to it, our possible role in it. It's not just about me. It's being placed in a world vastly larger than myself. And the fourth the striving to pay for one's arising as quickly as possible in order to be free to lighten the sorrow of our common Father, Creator. To be a contributor rather than a freeloader. It's really the antithesis of there's nothing I can do that matters. And the fifth, the striving to assist the most rapid perfecting of other beings, both those similar to oneself and those of other forms. We are not alone. Our species is not alone. And if we feel this, aren't we obliged to help as individuals? Do I know how to help? Perhaps it's in living with that as a question that something might become possible. So that's everything I wanted to say. And I'm reminded as I sit here talking to my computer of a story from Lord Pentland, known to many of you. And it was a story about a visiting pastor who went to a church up in Scotland and gave the sermon. And he walked up on the church and delivered the sermon very full of himself and having lots of important things to say. And as he looked out at the audience, he gradually became less and less inflated as they looked at him with great skepticism. And so he walked down off the pulpit, and the deacon was there. And he said to him a bit plaintively, "Well, how was it?" And the deacon said, "Well, if you went down the way you came up, if you came up the way you went down, then you might have come down the way you went up. So I can't see you all." And so I didn't quite get that feedback, but that story appears to me now as I sit here. Thanks very much. Be happy to try to respond to some questions.
Thank you, Charlie. That was absolutely astonishing what you've told us. So much detail, so much depth. Hard to know how to comprehend. But there are quite a lot of questions, but I feel they've arisen rather more from the earlier part of what you said. But the last one from Howard Blair, he's saying, "How optimistic are you really?" That's the last thing he writes. I don't know whether that's anything you can respond to.
Well, there's there's different scales on which to respond to that question. If I look at myself, it doesn't make me particularly optimistic. However, when I feel the sense of relationship, and I've been going on walks every day and just trying to experience the world. And in doing that, there's such feeling for it on occasion. So that makes me very hopeful in that moment, because it is possible in that moment to try to be in a more constructive relationship with the world that supports us. So that's a personal answer. Then there's the sort of global answer. Earth is going through a molting right now. in a very short period of time, the whole planet is being transformed. And moltings are difficult. And I think probably that there's going to need to be a serious planetary crisis for the people who remain to be drawn into action on a large enough scale to make a difference. If people get very sick, their attitude towards their life is transformed. They have a completely different recognition of what's important. It may be that Earth has to go through that kind of crisis as well for us to, enough of us to wake up to the reality of the situation often enough to make a difference.
So, Charlie, Ashley West asks, so what is the importance of feeling remorse here? Generally, I know all of this, but feel little or not enough. How can I dare to feel? I sort of resonate with that question, daring to feel.
It seems to me that's central. The facts, the ideas, they're important, they inform us. But what drives us to a change in behavior is the change in feeling for ourselves, for the earth, for this sense of connectivity that I think, it's not educated. It must be something that's inherent in the human being if we were able to come in contact with it.
Well, Suzanne Punch asks, Charlie, what changes have you personally been able to make in response to this understanding and worldview? It's a rather challenging question.
Well, my partner won't let me say I'm a vegan because I cheat sometimes. But starting a few years ago, I became largely vegan. I call myself an aspiring vegan. I don't eat any meat. I rarely eat cheese. So that's one practical thing. I have a big house, but I live in a small space on the third floor and rent out the lower parts of it, realizing that I really just didn't need to live in so much space. To me, it's this Native American poem. Now I walk in beauty. Beauty walks before me. Beauty walks behind me. Beauty all around me, above me and below me. If one could feel that more often, who knows what would happen?
Yeah, well, someone here is referring back to the knowledge of so-called primitive people who had a direct relationship with the earth. What has happened to their knowledge? Which has been gobbled up by civilization.
Yes, I think that's a two-edged sword that it's sort of like this development in the human being of essence and personality that civilization is like the personality. And it has a lot of capabilities. It has a lot of ability to interact with the world, do things. And it requires the equal development of both. So the development of technology and other things we associate with civilization make so much more possible on the earth, and make so much more possible for the earth and the universe, which capabilities would not be there without it. So it's not a matter of going back to the more primitive state of maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, when actually probably things were much more violent for human beings than they are today. We don't really know. But it's a matter of coming in touch with that primary relationship with the planet and combining it with the advances, amazing advances that knowledge and technology make possible. That's my view.
Well, this was always a question, wasn't it? Having, so to speak, foot in both camps, in the developed technological world and the world of the planet. But there's another question here I like from Suki Malloy, a question relating to the first part. As an Earth scientist, what do you feel about carbon sequestration? Does it make sense? I think that's a question which a lot of us have. I think you've probably answered it already, but
yes, it's the it's a big hope for climate change. So, if it could really be done for $100 a ton, that only adds like $1 to a gallon of gas, and so there's a lot of potential for it. The technological and infrastructure challenges to really implement that, as well as the administrative challenges, because it needs to be done globally, are absolutely huge. But if we could accomplish those, then it would have a lot of potential. And of course, there's a lot of very talented people working on that problem. I would just point out that if fusion power and hydrogen fuel and carbon sequestration arrive tomorrow, and amazingly, we implement them over the next 10 years, and the climate change problem is solved, the problem is not solved. The problem of population, meat-eating, destruction, groundwater, soils, egotism, it all remains.
So Andrew is asking, why do we constantly refer to technology as advancing when all the problems we are discussing are related to new technologies? Should we really continue to refer to technologies as advances? I think that's a complicated question, but because, as you're saying, some technology is going to help us, but others maybe not.
Yes, there's amazing technology behind video games.
Yeah.
I guess it all depends on what technology is in the service of. So, people can be very practical and inventive at inventing things, and they can invent things to help, and they can also invent weapons to destroy. So it's a two-edged sword. So I don't think one can make a blanket assessment. I think it's really, you have to look at technological change in the context of human change.
Very perilous. How human civilizations live are guided by their stories, beliefs, considering the exponential description of influences, one person influencing 5 years. What do you feel about the possibility of positive changes by virtue of a change of story?
Potentially very powerful, I think. Very powerful.
Mm.
You know, if we're just, it's so curious to me that when I speak to my Harvard colleagues, you know, all of whom I feel are smarter than I am, and you talk about this, about the problem, it always comes back to climate change and technology and social policy and all this kind of thing. It never really, it's always based on the fundamental storyline of we are human beings, we are users of the earth, we can do stuff to fix it. And that storyline of not having the experience of being a part of the earth moment by moment, which it seems to me is absolutely essential. But if you say something like that to any of them, their eyes glaze over. They just, it's deafening silence. It's silence of the deafening kind rather than the shared appreciation kind. So that's the story, right? That's the storyline. The storyline, you were an earth being. We don't have that storyline in our society.
Mm. Well, I think Pierre Zubert's question is absolutely relating to that. How can this connection and interconnection be educated? How can we get a new story?
You know, I think personally that a lot of it has to do with contact with nature, and contact with the reality of nature. I think if I have not visited one myself, but I think if we went to a factory farm for cows or pigs in a slaughterhouse for them, and we saw what the meat industry actually was, I think that would have an impact on us. And I find as I take walks and as I see the life around us, it has an influence. And so many people are really devoid of that experience. Living in the city and never getting out. And when we travel through the world, we travel in cars on roads. So I think that experiencing nature and trying to have people experience nature more may have a kind of a magical influence.
I think that's very helpful. And there's another question I like here from Anne Mia. It could be that these conditions are a result of the quality of our vibrations. What does this mean?
Yes, I mean, and some of the ideas of Gurdjieff, he would be saying that the growth in human population relates to vibrations that the earth needs, because it's not getting the necessary vibrations from smaller populations. So it needs lots of people and lots of deaths.
Mm.
This is mysterious to me, and I think would require a more special state and knowledge to understand than I can muster.
Mm. How much time does humanity have left? Howard Blair asks.
I think it's we don't realize how quickly things can change. Look what happened in Yugoslavia, a modern European country, and what happened there. Look what happened in the United States during the Trump years. COVID-19 turns out to have been a fairly mild disease. It would be possible to have a much more lethal disease come along. In human society, in human civilization, it has happened in the last 5,000 to 10,000 years. And from a geological perspective, that has been absolutely exceptional in terms of its climate stability. It's just amazingly stable climate. And in the time of civilization, since Mesopotamia, there has been no major volcanic eruption. So you say, well, what about Santorini or something like that? There are volcanic eruptions. Santorini destroyed the Crete civilization and had a big effect on the Mediterranean. There are eruptions that are 1,000 times larger than that. That would have there was an eruption in the 18th century that led to the year without a summer in North America. That was a pretty big one, 100 cubic kilometers. There are 10,000 cubic kilometer eruptions. So that would lead to a few years without summers globally. And you can imagine what would happen to global food supply, and you can imagine what would happen in any big city if you cut off the food supply. In the historical record, there are cities that around 1500 BC had been around for 1,000 years. So around much, much longer than any city in North America. And overnight, they disappeared. The archaeologists don't know what happened. What happened? The city just went away. Rome at its height had 1 million people. 150 years or 200 years later, it had 60,000. Things can change really fast. So I think it's very hard for us to know how long we have.
Well, we have been promised major eruptions and earthquakes, and it said it's overdue that for us to have some climactic type of catastrophe.
Yes, right. Geologically soon. Is that next year or 5,000 years from now?
Yes. Well, you have the benefit of a lot of experience of different time scales. But most of us can't think, I think, in that scale.
Yeah, the timescales are very important also for climate change. We're thinking on decadal timescales now, 2030, 2050, 2100 maybe. But most of the CO2 that we have pumped into the atmosphere, unless we undergo massive carbon sequestration, that's going to be in the atmosphere for 10,000 years. And so we say, restrict things to 2.5 degrees warming. No way. There's a lot of inertia in the climate system. So The people who study it think that the melting of the Greenland ice sheet is inevitable. That raises sea level by 7 meters, 21 feet. Not this century, but 200 years, 400 years. Similar things are going on in Antarctica. So what we are doing now has centuries long, many, many generations long impacts on the future of the Earth and humanity.
I think that is one of the great difficulties in contemplating the situation. Is that on the one hand, we, as you said, we have possibilities of action, but on the other hand, the planet itself has its own agenda. It's as you say, things can change suddenly. It seems to me that we are not able to contact or relate to what the planet is doing itself for itself, as it were.
True.
People are asking, what can we trust?
Yeah. Also very difficult. If you just getting accurate data that is verifiable, if you go on the internet, it's difficult. So
that's very interesting, because the data you've brought is, most of us haven't seen that in such a stark form.
Yes, the data in the scientific literature, gets distorted in the press and on websites, and it's very difficult to really have accurate data.
Well, I'm throwing through the questions. I think we've touched on most of the. Einstein said that nothing will benefit human health and increase the chances for survival of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet. I think you've come out pretty strongly on that side of things.
Yeah, I mean the advantages of a vegetarian diet are so huge. It's good for the planet. It's nicer to the animals, of course, and it's very good for human health. And so the body mass index, the incidence of heart disease, being diabetic, and so on, all of these things are positively impacted. And of course, a primary cause of, for example, budget deficits in the United States until recently was the growth in healthcare costs. And if many people became vegetarian, they become healthier and the healthcare costs go way down. So it's a big help to government expenditures and makes money available to do other things like deal with climate issues. So as far as I know, there's no downside to it, apart from the fact that we like meat.
Well, aren't some of us with certain blood types inclined to eat meat historically, genetically? Or is that a myth? Do the O positives of this world have to give up their craving for meat? Speaking as one.
Okay. All right, that's one of those areas where it might be difficult to get the best facts, and I don't have them.
No, but I wanted to ask one more thing, Charlie, which nobody has flagged up, and how much money and how much human energy of all sorts is being used up to find life on other planets. Is this a complete red herring, or do we imagine that there's some other, so to speak, other agenda which could change the situation on Earth?
Change the situation because life on other planets would interact with us, or we could migrate somewhere.
Migrate, mine, find more ways than other planets to plunder. Yeah,
so there's I often say there are two aspects, and then I end up saying three or four. But so let me just start. We are exquisitely attuned to our planet. Exquisitely. So if I go to Mexico or India, I get sick, right? So that's the same planet, but just a different country. And if we went back in time, we would infect those beings with our microbes and kill them all off because they'd have no protection against them. If we went back 15% of Earth's history, there's nothing for us to eat. Nothing. And in fact, there's not enough oxygen in the air for us to breathe. So we are attuned to this planet at this moment. And it's taken 4.5 billion years for that exquisite tuning to occur. So there's no way in hell we go to another planet and pop down on the surface and live there easily. The idea of colonizing Mars is ridiculous. The idea of terraforming another planet, guess what? It took Earth 4.5 billion years to terraform, to produce the conditions suitable for us. And if we went to another planet that had done its own forming, it would be exquisitely tuned to the life on that planet and completely unsuitable for us. Now, the same thing applies then to aliens. They can't come down onto the planet Earth. They can't come down and, munch down on our cornfields. Their bodies would be completely unsuited to it. So what do they want? What would they want from us? They want our oil. They want to come down and get our oil. Well, if they're undergoing interplanetary space travel, they have starlight and nuclear fusion, and they have no need for oil. They want our metal. They want our iron. Well, there's asteroids out there that are just completely richer and richer ore deposits than anything that we have on Earth. So Earth is a big place. It's big gravitational load to land on it and get anything off of it. You can land on a little asteroid somewhere and get everything you need. So they are not maleficent. They have no reason to exploit us. They have no reason to attack us. They have no reason to use our resources. If they exist and they're out there, they've also survived through their own planetary crisis. And so they have this feeling. They have this feeling for the universe and for the world. And if they have that feeling, all they're going to want to do is help.
Well, I think a lot of people are talking about education and how to share something new with younger generation.
There's a lot of hope in the younger generation, and there's a lot of hope in women.
That's also being mentioned, yes.
That's if you look, for example, at the young activists who are having a lot of influence, people like Greta Thunberg, but she's not the only one. Many of them are young, teenagers, early 20s, and mostly women. So there's a lot of hope there, I think.
Well, I think that's a lot, Charlie. Shall we say good night to our audience? Good afternoon.
Ben, would it be possible to see everyone?
Wow.
Just turn on the videos.
Well, I think you can. I'll see what I'll see. Let me just see. Hold on a minute. Let's see what we can do. There's a lot of people coming up. Yes, here you go. Here's the human race. I think you have to, you have to go, let's just see. Yeah.
It's so nice to see everyone. Thank you for coming. Okay, Ben?
Yep. Wonderful. That's a feast, isn't it?
Bye.
Thank you, Charlie, so much. It's been rich food. So I think it's up to you to
And
press the button and leave us to reflect.